Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 179 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am your host, Neelan, the Orange Tank, and with me, as always, are my co-hosts, the Green Tank, Mark, and the Red Tank, Kellen.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
This week on the Board Game Barrage podcast, ignorance is bliss. We're going to be talking about when it's appropriate to look up information about the game you've been playing before or after, whether that includes strategies or balance problems with a game, whether to keep that to yourself or disclose that to the other players, or whether it's better just to live in blissful ignorance and just say, the game's great, I don't need to know.
My life is wonderful.
Exactly, Kellen, and the longer that you believe that, the longer it will be true. Before we move on, this week, excitingly, if you've been listening for the last couple of episodes, we've got a $50 gift card to give away as a result of our draft episode. So everyone that submitted their votes for the winner, we'll be announcing that result later in the episode. So stick around for that. But before we get to that, we're going to be talking about the games that we've been playing this week, and among them are Genoa and Durian, which Kellen will be talking about, Search for Planet X, which I'll be covering, and Pavlov's House, which Mark will be talking about. So let's kick it off with Kellen. Which of those two games do you want to talk about first?
I had the opportunity to play some games with my brother and his friends, and I always take those opportunities to find the games that I love and want to revisit and play through. So we played through a good game of modern art, a game of Durian, and a game of Genoa. And I wanted to just quickly touch on a few things. Genoa is one of my top 50 board games of all time. It is a 2001 release that in many ways feels like sidereal confluence in a more Euro, more trading in the Mediterranean sense, which is to say that it is a Euro game all about negotiation. I adore this game and am really wondering if maybe there's a way that we could bring it back. But there are a few things holding it back, and one of them is the length of the game of Genoa. What's interesting about the game is that each turn you are moving this colossal set of discs around the board, but you can only take one action. And that means that every other action that you land on, every other board space that you land on, you just auction it off to everyone that's with you. But you can also decide not to move. So Neelan says, Kellen, I really, really want the spices. And I'll say, great, give me $10. And he says, no, I'll give you $5. And then I'll say, my turn's over. And that is how Genoa goes. It really is a delightful Euro game that I think runs 30 to an hour too long. And it does have a variable play timer to kind of help with the math calculating. And this is actually the mechanism that I wanted to sort of discuss, which is I like seeing games that use dice in a way that most people might find unpalatable, which is to say that every turn in Genoa, you roll 2 d10s, and that's where you start your turn. But Kellen, that's unfair. That's unfair. Every turn you just roll the dice. Well, it works surprisingly well in Genoa, and if you land in the center 4 squares of the board, that actually removes an entire round of the game, of which there are only 8 in a 4-player. And so you can't do as much planning as you want. And then there's also a special tile that allows you to pick where you start, and you can also choose to start in the middle to push the tempo further along in the game. I find Genoa to have one of the most interesting uses of dice that doesn't bother me, because no matter where you end up, you're able to sell those actions to the other players, and you can actually only use one of the 5 actions that you land near anyway. But it is still a big dose of luck or randomness, and I love seeing examples of that in board games where it's like, oh, roll to move is dead. It doesn't work in modern games. And then, example of something that kind of uses a mechanism in a way that makes it work. Mark, I know you like Genoa. We still have not had our big game of Genoa with the 4 of us.
Yeah, I think we've all played it separately, right? But never with each other.
Oh, I didn't even know you played it.
Yeah, I played it once, but not with either of you.
Yeah, it seems like a perfect game for all of us to play together. But I agree, though, that it's just a little bit too long. It's still not enough to knock it off. I think it's on my top 50 still, if not, if it's hovering very close to it. And whenever we start playing it, I always think that variable thing is going to rear its head a little bit more and cut down on the playtime because, it depends on the dice rolls. And there's always that, hope is too strong of a word, but, that hope that it's going to trim enough time to make it a little more palatable, but it never ends up working out that way. But yeah, it's a game that I really, really enjoy. But yeah, if it's only half an hour shorter, it'd be pretty close to perfect.
I had the position of getting an early lead and then deciding, oh, this is perfect. I can rush the end game. And so then for the next, I think, last 3 turns, I was just like, bam, 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 to make the game shorter, which made the group enjoy it more and also secured my devastating win.
Lopsided?
Whatever would make it seem like I won by a lot, because I won by a lot.
I'll edit that in post.
And then on the other side of the house, we ended with a light game of Durian, one of the most recent Oink games. And I wanted to revisit this just because I think the well, the dam, whatever breaks has broken for me in terms of the Oink game collection. I think that I have probably 30 of them, I would say, on this shelf behind me. And I think that I am done attempting to collect all of them. And I no longer see that as a noble pursuit. But
you saw it as a noble pursuit?
well, everything that I do is a noble pursuit. I'm I'm the noble knight at the center of my universe.
Yeah.
Durian is this amazing game of, Durian is this amazingly cute game of little gorillas running a shop. And you are playing a version of Liar's Dice, sort of like Hanabi, where you can see every card but your card. And you are building a order that the gorillas have to try to get together in the store, but you can't see all the resources that are available. And so on your turn, you're essentially calling BS by ringing a little bell that the game comes with. And if you ring the bell, you're saying, I don't think we have enough of the material that we need, whether that's be bananas, strawberries, or durians. I know we played this game last year during the pandemic outdoors with masks on, and, I've had a chance to revisit it. What a delightfully cute game. And actually, I think the easiest way to articulate this is that I've been asked by some members of the Discord to sort of tier rank every Oink game because I've played a lot of them. And so those tier ranks are usually S tier, which is sort of like the best of all time. Then there's the A tier, the B tier, the C tier, and usually like the D tier or F tier. In this case, Durian, I feel like, is a very low B tier or a very solid C tier game. It is not in my A tier, and it's not in the S tier of Oink games, which I consider to be things like Startups and Deep Sea Adventure and Insider. And so with that said, I'm not sure how much room I have in my collection for B tier anything. This may have more to do with the fact that my closet is overflowing. Durian has some of the cutest art, the cutest production. There's a little bell, little wood stands. I love the cards. I love the card art. If I halved my Oink collection now, it would stick around. And yet, I have a hard time saying, go pick this one up. It is a very light Liar's Dice-like game. Liar's Dice is fantastic all on its own. And that is where I'm sitting with Durian. I know there's been many people asking us to sort of revisit some of these games that we talk about. And so just wanted to give that update on a solid B-tier Oink game, Durian.
So, in the hypothetical that you're, culling your Oink collection, does everything below B go? Or everything below A go, by the sound of it?
That would have to be in context of the rest of the collection. Yeah. But I think that eventually everything in the B tier would have to go. But I do think that Durian would make a delightful game for many types of gamers who don't have this sort of small box. There's another category of Oink game, which is, what do you call, a one and done, a dash and dine, where there is a gimmick, and it's fun to show people the gimmick, and everybody enjoys the game for that gimmick. And that is not what Durian is. I think Durian is, solid, but it's not going to live up to the best of the best fillers. Things like For the King and Me, some of our favorite filler games here on the Board Game Barrage podcast.
How dare you?
Or Blue Lagoon, that classic filler.
Classic filler.
Getting it on all sides tonight.
Random, and we can include this or not include this. My father, who listens to the show religiously despite hating board games and only agreeing to play Telestrations, has decided that we need a dictionary of terminology that we could put on the wiki.
Yeah, that's a good place for it.
almost like our definitions of some of our own words, but even some of these, he's like, I heard about this thing called deck building, and you said it's a deck builder, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. So everything you said after that meant nothing to me.
Yeah.
But it may be cute to have something internal that's like, here are the 12 most common board game terms, and then people could contribute to that, and it becomes like a little fun.
And I think what's even good about that is once it exists and say deck builder comes up, we can say the one sentence description and then say, hey, we actually have some of these terms defined over here.
If you want
more information.
More. Yeah. That could be fun to do that rather than sending them into BGG land where it's
right.
Who knows what they'll find out there. Anyway, that was Durian, an Oink game, and Genoa, a game that you can find on the BGG marketplace for cheap if you are ever wanting to try out that negotiation game.
The game I'm going to be talking about is called The Search for Planet X. This is by Foxtrot Games and Renegade. This was a Kickstarter that fulfilled sometime toward the beginning of last year and kind of just languished on my shelf for the longest time, as most games did during COVID. I got to play this fairly recently. I played a couple of 2-player games with a friend of the podcast, Marnie, and then I had a few 3-player games of it this weekend. And I think the thing that was so telling about both those sessions is after playing it once the first time, we immediately wanted to play it again and again. The Search for Planet X is a pure deduction game. It is a game where up to 4 players will be seated around the board, which represents sort of a circular section of sky. Now, there are 2 difficulties of the game, so I'm going to be talking about the standard difficulty, in which the sky is divided into 12 sectors. Every single one of these sectors has some sort of celestial body, whether that's a gas cloud, or a comet, or an asteroid, or a dwarf planet. Or, in one of the sectors, there's Planet X. And the through line for what you're trying to do in the deduction of this game is to find Planet X, because that is one way to get a large chunk of points. But crucially, it's not the only way to win. In fact, I've had games where I found Planet X and lost, because a lot of what you're also doing throughout the game is just by locating where on the map different objects are, you're going to get points for those objects if you manage to submit theories for them before the end of the game. So to break down how this all works, this is an app-driven game. So at the start of the game, you're going to all sign into an app using a specific game code, and you will get a small collection of information that is specific to you and you alone. Some of the information is shared with other players, but your set of information is specific to you. And that will say, okay, there's not an asteroid in Sector 1, there's not a gas cloud in Sector 3, and so on, until you have about, I think in the normal difficulty, there's 8 discrete pieces of information that you're going to be crossing off on your sheet. And then you take a series of actions using a patchwork-style timing system. What that means is whenever you take an action, it costs a certain amount of time, and whoever's furthest back is going to be taking the next turn. So if you take an action that takes a lot more time, it might take a little while before it gets back to your turn if other players are taking smaller actions. The actions of the game are pretty simple. You choose some sectors, you pick an object, and you say, okay, how many asteroids are there in sectors 7 to 12? You put that into the app will say there's 2 asteroids in those sectors, and now you have some information about what's in the night sky. Crucially, only half of the sky is visible at any given time. The sky sort of rotates as the players move around the board using time. So that's quite cool as well. There's limited availability in order to survey certain sections of the sky. Another action you can take is just straight up, hey, tell me what's in this sector, but you can only do that twice in the entire game. And then the other action is a research action, where there are these 6 different logic topics, where if you choose which one you want to research, will tell you a new logic rule for the game. All of the different bodies also have their own rules that are consistent from game to game, kind of like asteroids are always next to each other, gas clouds are always next to empty space, and so on. I'm not going to go into all of them, but it's enough little information to, over the course of a game of maybe 8, 9, 10 different actions, in order to feel like you've mapped out a substantial portion of the sky and hopefully found the location of Planet X. The way that the theory system works is every so often you sort of just have to secretly submit, okay, I'm going to put either 0, 1, or 2 theories out on this board. And that's kind of just saying, I think an asteroid's in this sector. Then after a certain amount of time, it moves towards the middle. And once it's revealed, you see whether that theory was correct. That's going to get you points at the end of the game, but it's also obviously revealing information to other players. So it's this very clever system where in order to have a viable score, and I want to emphasize this, you have to submit theories to have a viable score. almost every game I've seen where a player only found Planet X but kept a lot of information to themselves, they did not end up being the winner of the game, which struck me as a really cool point of balance in this. You have to be revealing some information in order to benefit of it. Like, the game is in some ways modeling like the astronomical science community. So it's kind of this neat little balance of having to give some to get some. I liked this a lot. I think this is a really, really solid deduction game. I had one potential issue with it. And I say issue in quotes because the main thing that struck me is that this fear that the game is a little bit more random than I'd like to believe, that if you just happen to get the crucial subset of information and happen to like scan the right sectors of the sky that meshes with your starting information at the right time, you're going to be the first one to unravel the mystery. Because as in a lot of deduction games, it's kind of like this domino effect. Once you find one thing, it's just going to keep solving the rest and the rest of the sky. But I don't mind that because of how much fun I had doing this. And everyone I've played it with so far has thoroughly enjoyed the experience of doing this. Even though it's a very sort of solitary kind of experience, the way that you are sort of second guessing people's information and the actions they're taking in order to potentially use some of their information is really, really, really cool.
I see here that it says that it's about an hour-long game. Does that seem accurate to you?
I would say so. I would say 45 minutes to an hour at around the 2 to 3 player count. I would think it would only maybe stretch to an hour if at 4 players maybe. All the games I played, I would say it was about 45 minutes tops.
And how does this rank with you with other like deduction-y games like Alchemist and Cryptid and that kind of sort of
Cluedo?
That's a great question because it compares very, very favorably to the games that are very pure deduction, right? Like, it's been a while since I played Cryptid. Cryptid is, albeit a little bit simpler, but I think I like this more than Cryptid. One of the things that's interesting is Unwanted Guests is another Cluedo-style deduction game that sort of I had played for the first time right before the quarantine started, and I'm actually planning on revisiting very soon to finally talk about it. And this feels like in the same ballpark as that. But when it comes to Alchemist, I think it's everything else that's layered on top of Alchemist that actually kind of elevates that a little bit more for me, because in some ways, the deduction proportion of Alchemist on its own isn't enough to make a game. And I think it needs like the worker placement Euro portion to really work well together. But this works in the context of just being an interesting puzzle that you can tackle in different ways. Like, for example, the times I've played it, I always go for like figuring out the asteroids first, and then I always kick myself afterwards and not being, I should have done this first, because it,
that's a loser strategy.
Exactly,
for the
Alan,
asteroids.
Exactly. Who goes for the asteroids first?
Gas clouds.
When the gas clouds are right there. Exactly. And I think that's actually one of the things I find the most interesting about it, is it's felt like a different puzzle that has different routes into it each time I played it. It feels like however they've designed the app to construct this puzzle does feel quite intricate.
Will it run on my Nokia N-Gage?
Almost certainly not. Which is, I don't know.
A shame.
A shame. The N-Gage was robbed.
Speaking of the app, like, what are your feelings about the app integration in general? Like, solid, too much? Generally, what do you think?
It's pretty reliant on the app. You know, every action you take is an input into the app and an output. So, like, it's so tied to the app that that's a hard question. I think this will put a lot of people off. And I think I should say that quite clearly. If you are the sort of person that does not typically like app integration, this is as far leaning in that direction as possible, you know? The board and feeling like you're writing on paper and all that is kind of crucial to the whole thing. So it's tempting to say, oh, this could have just been a video game. It still has board presence. It still benefits from the physical space. You're never like consulting the app constantly. I think that's the thing that's smart about it. You're only ever querying the app, and then all of your deduction is just happening on your sheet of paper in front of you. So I think it does get the balance right for my tastes, at least. But yeah, I think this is just kind of a lovely production that also does well by its theme. You know, they're kind of mapping real world astronomy as best as they can kind of onto this idea. You know, the idea that the sky is, you know, is constantly changing and the telescopes have to sort of spend certain amounts of time scanning certain sectors of it. Like, it kind of all maps in a way that makes a lot of sense.
It kind of seems that like it has that shared scientific discovery thing of alchemists.
Exactly.
Where
that's what I was going to say. Yeah, like the idea that you are putting theories out and then other people are building their theories based on your theories is such a cool idea. One of the things that's also pretty neat about it is actually finding Planet X is something you can't do directly, because whenever you scan for Planet X, it always reveals itself as empty space. So you can only sort of infer its existence by the objects around it, which is a very like astronomical sort of thing when it comes to like distant extraterrestrial planets. So it's neat. It does.
All right,
it does
Mensa
cool things
nerds.
like that.
Turn it off.
That is
You passed the test a long time ago.
That is The Search for Planet X by Foxtrot and Renegade. I like it a lot. If you're into deduction, I think you'll dig this one.
A complete aside, I feel like the debate about I hate my apps in my games has subsided in the last 2 years. I think it's like a foregone conclusion that everyone has a smartphone and is no longer like something that people care about.
I think that's probably true. I know that there are definitely people that I've seen in the Daryl just like can't be having with it though.
Still?
I also think that there wasn't the like takeover of board games by apps that people sort
Yeah.
of feared at one point.
Yeah.
Mark, tell us about Pavlov's House.
So I found myself in Vegas again this weekend. Thank God Christina is not on the episode to slander my good name. But speaking of which, I was sort of low on funds. So I found myself one night dipping my toe back into solitaire gaming. Couldn't afford any friends this time around. And decided to give Pavlov's House a shot. Pavlov's House is designed by David Thompson, who's also the designer of War Chest and also the series of games for What Remains, which is another game of his that has piqued my interest. He seems to design a lot of war games. For What Remains is a recently released and fairly highly touted game that I'm keen to play, but I did get a chance to play, as I mentioned, Pavlov's House, a game from 2018. Pavlov's House is listed as a 1 to 3 player game, but it's actually just a solo game, and you could play it with multiple players, but basically what you're doing is just like spreading the turns out. So really it's a solo game. What you're doing in Pavlov's House in a very sort of simple way is it's sort of like a tower defense game. Pavlov's House was a key strategic point in the Battle of Stalingrad, which I actually am not so familiar with, but I did love playing this game and having the actual people from the battle represented in the game because it naturally piqued my interest and made me interested in looking more into that. So that's one thing as I've said on the show, that I love games that are steeped into historical scenarios. But Pavlov's House was a house in this Battle of Stalingrad that the Russians were trying to hold as the Germans were sort of surrounding them. And what you're trying to do is basically just survive in the house. You're trying to fight off the German onslaught and hold out as long as you can. And if you can get through the entire deck of German attack cards, you have a chance of potentially winning the game. The board itself is split into 3 parts. And I've heard a lot of criticism about the board. The board is very, I guess, clip art, so that's fair enough. But also criticism of the manual, which I think actually is done really well. And the way that the board is constructed, you have these 3 aspects of Stalingrad. You have on the far right third of the board, it's like a satellite view of the area. And then the middle of the board is sort of like a city block. And then the final third of the board, which is on the left side, is the actual house itself. And the way that you play it is you work your way from the right side, the satellite view, to the inside, the far left side of the board. So the first thing you do is, again, you're on the satellite view, and this is the most strategic aspect of your turn. You draw 4 cards. Each card has 2 actions on it, and you select 1 action from 3 of the cards. So you'll have a maximum of 4 cards, each of them with 2 actions. You select 3 actions, 1 from 3 different cards. Mixed into the cards are some fog of war cards, and if those come up, they just limit the number of actions you can select from. But what you're doing in this aspect of the game is you're trying to set out long-term strategy for fighting off the Germans who are coming in. That can be in terms of resupplying Pavlov's House. That can be in terms of setting up anti-aircraft. That can be in terms of strengthening your communication to get more turns in the game. And that can also be repairing damage that the Germans have done, because the next phase of the game is the German onslaught. And then that part is you flip over the top 3 cards of the German deck and you do what it says there. And that can be an aerial attack on that satellite portion of the board where they're damaging your strategic ability. That can be sending soldiers into this center portion of the board, which is them actually attacking Pavlov's House. So that's when they take their turn. And then finally, you work your way to the left side of the board, and that's when you're in Pavlov's House, where you are moving troops from the sort of reserves onto sections of the house itself and then choosing whether to, resupply or to provide suppression fire or to try to attack the oncoming German assault.
Are his dogs inside or outside the house?
The dogs are Kickstarter exclusive, so you can try to
you don't
get
have
that. I was
those.
playing with the base game. Yeah, for anybody who's listening, to be clear, I played without the dog upgrade.
Quick question, Mark. The game's progressing from one stage to stage 2 to stage 3, or are they all happening like simultaneously?
No, they're progressing. So you're
Okay.
going satellite view, block view, house view, and then you're going back. Satellite.
I see.
block,
It just
house,
cycles through them all. Okay.
It cycles through and through. The German deck is tiered, so you'll have a sense as you play the game over and over again of what they're capable of, although it's obviously shuffled, so you're not sure. So the way that the Germans are attacking you, the way that you're fighting off the Germans, the way a lot of the things are happening in this game are based on dice rolls. So there's there's a bit of luck factor there. But when it comes to the dice rolling, it's got the sort of Cthulhu War situation where you're rolling a number of dice. You're not rolling as much as Cthulhu War, but you're rolling usually a number of dice, and there's only successes on 5 and 6s, so it's not that wide of a variance. Also, there's a lot of ways to mitigate if you're willing to put in the resources. But mitigation is a resource drain, and this is a game where, like a lot of other tower defense games, you're just trying to survive a lot of times. You're just taking your incremental gains when you can, but for the most part, you're just trying to hold out. I really enjoyed it. I'm not too big of a solo game player, but playing this made me want to play it again. Again, it might have been the historical aspect to it that made me interested and sort of like got its hooks into me. And I'm not sure how much the luck is going to be affecting my long-term view of the game. But this game ended with me barely surviving. I made it through the entire German deck. I played it on the standard difficulty, but I made it through the entire German deck, but my troops were just decimated, and I ended up, there's a calculation you have to make. You don't have to just survive, you also have to, you score points for people who survive, you lose points for the Germans who are still attacking, and I ended up with a losing score. Not a major defeat, a minor defeat, to be clear about that, but a defeat nonetheless. But it did make me want to play it again and try to go, try to succeed, even think about doing the more difficult scenarios. But yeah, just really well designed, and for as many chits and as intimidating as it sort of looks, it is a really straightforward, easy to learn once you start playing a couple times. Not a lot of edge cases. Really nice solo war game that I would definitely recommend.
I think it says a lot, Mark, that despite it being a World War II game, which is a theme that I have zero interest in, I actually kind of want to play this. Like, looking at the board and like that 3-tiered kind of level of abstraction thing is pretty cool. Like, I like the idea of that a lot.
Yeah, it's really nicely done, I think. I mean, it's like as intuitive as you could, I think, hope for a game like this. That 3-tier system feels good. It feels like really well done. I guess I enjoyed it.
That's cool.
And that is Pavlov's House, The Battle of Stalingrad by David Thompson.
So before we move to our feature topic, let's talk about winners.
Winner, winner, chicken dinner.
Kellen, take us away.
Do we have to reveal the results
Yeah, we gotta.
of the poll? Well, could be like our little secret.
Can we do a review of what we guessed?
We don't have to.
No.
I think the
Recap.
people know.
No. All right. So thank you, everyone who submitted poll results for this draft. As a reminder, Mark, Neelan, and I drafted top 5 games from the BGG Top 100 to make a little collection. I selected Gloomhaven, Scythe, Concordia, Gaia Project, and Clank. Neelan selected Brass Birmingham, Root, Codenames, Twilight Imperium, the 4th edition, and Arkham Horror, the card game. And Mark selected Spirit Island, Pax Pamir 2nd edition, Wingspan, El Grande, and A Feast for Odin. We had hundreds and hundreds of responses to this, and what I just want to say right off the bat is this is all within polling margin errors, okay? If you've ever seen election results as they sort of come in, they have the little disclaimer in the bottom left, blah, 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 Cambridge Analytica, plus or minus 8%.
Are you asking to stop the count?
And Mark has won the poll with 38.7% of the votes. I have come in second, first loser, with 33.5% of the vote. And Neelan has come in dead last, third of third, with 27.8%. But again, we all each have hundreds of votes, and when you factor in sort of that scientific polling,
Right.
it could be a statistical wash, if we want to call it that.
And if you bias the votes by quality, which we haven't done in this case, then...
That's true.
Kellen, are you familiar with Barry Sanders, the great Detroit running back?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't believe you. But Barry Sanders was a phenomenal running back, and what he was known for was, among other things, among being one of the greatest running backs of all time, was when he scored touchdowns, he would give the ball to the ref and just walk back to the bench. And that's all I'm doing. I'm not celebrating. I'm acting like I've been there before. Just going to accept it and move on.
Do you understand the statistical difference between 38.7% and 33.5%, Mark?
The difference is 5.2%, Kellen.
Okay, Mark. Okay. Even the audience try-harding it up here and Mark with our first. No, but thank you all so much for participating. We want to do more drafts and we want to do more gift card giveaways. And as a reminder, we are now going to give away a $50 gift card to an online game store of your choice. And funnily enough, I forgot to collect people's names, so I will be emailing the winner as soon as we get off of this recording tonight. But the winner of the $50 gift card, your email address starts with the letter C, it ends with the letter A at gmail.com. We are about to email you. We will collect names next time. We'll announce this on Twitter and Facebook when they select a store, which we hope will be Game Nerds, but could be Target, could be any online game store that you choose. And yeah, look for more of these gift card giveaways. We're going to try to do one a month. Would be something fun to do for the community. Thank you again for participating, except for the what percentage was that, Mark?
5.2, Kellen.
Please stop listening, the 5.2% of the show. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kellen. Let's get into the feature topic this week, which is on the topic of ignorance. But not of the bad kind, the blissful sort of ignorance. You know, when you play a board game and you feel that maybe something was a little bit up with it, maybe it didn't go quite the way you thought it did, do you then go onto Board Game Geek? Do you then try to find... was that strategy that Mark used that made him get 55,000 points from collecting blessing tokens, which no one was doing throughout the game except Mark? Is that a little bit weird? Is that a little bit busted? Is that the normal way to win the game? What about the balance?
If it's in the rule book, it's all legal.
What about that Fox Clan in Rising Sun? Does everyone else think that's a little bit overpowered? But maybe you're not the sort of gaming group where that matters so much. Maybe living in this sort of blissful ignorance makes a lot of sense, where why burden yourself with the knowledge that something might be broken about a game that you like? That's the topic for this week.
Why burden yourself with knowledge, period?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just follow through the ideals of blissful ignorance to all facets of your life. Knowledge is a trap and science is the devil's tool. So one of the things I wanted to open up with is kind of, can you think of sort of examples of games or sessions or times where you've done this, where you sort of given into that need to either, you know, before or after a game, find out what people are saying about it? Kellen?
So for me, it's almost never immediately after the first game. I do not trust first plays very often to give a good sense of the balance. I'm always kind of shocked, actually, because I think Mark is more, and we'll get into this probably, more okay with saying, I think this is unbalanced. Here's an example. I've been playing a lot of Splendor on Board Game Arena, like literally, and this is in my top 50. I've played Splendor 50 times in person, let's say 70 times in person, and I just keep losing online near the end of the game, and it feels kind of random which tier 3 cards come out or which tier 2 cards come out. They don't synergize with what I've invested in, to the point that I started asking around on the Discord, hey, is Splendor just like, is it kind of random when you get to the end game? You know, and the reason that I ask that is because I've read enough about Splendor in the collective conscious, and I've never heard anyone say Splendor is not balanced. I've never heard anyone identify Splendor is great except for blank. And so my way of like trying to investigate this was trying to ask somewhat casually, as opposed to, you know, going on Board Game Geek. There's actually like a strategy section for each game where you can go and just read people who are like, here's what you have to do to win the game. So there's something nice about Discord and sort of like a, hey, has anyone, experienced X, Y, or Z, to have a little bit of a softer way to ask that question. I think my running theory right now is that asynchronous Splendor, you aren't really paying attention to what everyone else is doing. It's harder to keep in your head what they're going for and really hate draft against them. And I think in person, I keep that in my head. So I don't believe it has anything to do with the actual balance of Splendor, but that is the most recent example of me going, maybe I hadn't noticed this in all the time that I've played this game, and seeking out sort of some kind of consensus from the community.
I think the way this manifests for me is a lot of times when I'm playing a game for the first time, when I'm being taught the rules or when I'm reading the rules themselves, I will sort of target a way to approach the game. I'll think to myself, okay, it seems like you get a lot of points by doing this, so let me just try to hammer that button. Let me try to do that. Or, we'll be playing a game and early on I'll think that, okay, one well of points is not being exploited. Let me be the one to exploit that well of points and see what happens. What I'm thinking of is, as Nealon alluded to, is the way we played Tekhenu, where I had a card that allowed me to get points for blessings, and I just hoarded the blessings the entire time. Speaking of hoarding, the other time that is springing to mind where I did this is our game of Ruination, where I, again, was hoarding the favor tokens, I think they're called, noticing that they were worth a point for every 2, and also knowing that if I hoarded them, nobody else could get them to reroll the dice, so I just decided to hoard them, and that ended up being successful in the end. That's just the way I try to play games. I just try to find a way to win. But when it works out that way, sometimes it doesn't feel great. I mean, it feels better than losing for sure, but sometimes it doesn't feel great. And so I will sometimes go online and see if people have considered that or are calling that a broken strategy or what they say about it. Usually it's not. Usually, as Callan sort of alluded to, the first game is not a good litmus test of the game stability as a whole, but that is something that will cause me to look into strategic talk about a game.
I think that's right, and that's actually Tekhenu was like one of the key examples I had for this, because that was the one time I try to stop myself from doing this, but there are times where I feel like I come out of a game so like convinced that something was just so wrong about that game that I just have to know if it's in the conversation or not. And that game of Tekhenu was one example of it, where it just struck me as this cannot be the way that this card is intended to work. And the urge that strikes me is this like very selfish, do the designers know about this? And like, it's like I find the thread, right, where like Turchi's talking about the card and saying, oh, if you think it's overpowered, then this and this and this. And then eventually they do actually cap the score on the card. So it becomes like this weird conversation where, oh, they obviously didn't know about that. And like that's the stuff that sometimes fascinates me, because I always just love to know as much behind the scenes about the development process for a game, and like how things that do emerge during what is effectively public playtesting once they get released, how much of that stuff was known to the designers prior to the release. I find that interesting. But I think on the flip side of that, the reason I talked about Search for Planet X this week, and the reason why this topic sort of came to my mind, was because I had similar thoughts about certain things about Planet X. Not only just, is it more random than I'm willing to believe, but also specifically about some of the actions. It seems to me that you should do this action, then this action, then this action, and so on. And now I didn't want to look that up, and I still haven't yet, because on the flip side, I have been enjoying all of those games. Like, nothing about them felt bad or broken. Like, everyone had a good time playing them, and the results seemed to match up with expectation. Like, the person that most deserved to win seemed to have won. So why ruin the magic a little bit by sort of, peeking behind the curtain on that? Because almost certainly there will be a lot of people on Board Game Geek making that sort of claim, and a lot of debate back and forth. And there's no real winning when you go into that den, as it were. You don't come back unchanged. You're just always going to have like a slightly tainted perception of the game from that point on, in my opinion. So it's like an urge I try to fight whenever I can, for sure.
Yeah, I think one of the ways this manifests is games with asymmetric powers. I will often look for lists of the hardest faction to play to the easiest faction to play, to give myself typically the hardest faction just to smooth things over. I know like Christina and I played Cthulhu Wars Duel, the 2-player version, right, which is the most recent release from Peterson Games. And in that one player is playing Cthulhu and one player is playing Black Goat. And Cthulhu is way more straightforward in how they play. And I had that knowledge from a previous version of Cthulhu Wars, but I would select the Black Goat faction in my first couple of games with different people just because I knew that would make for a better experience. So there are certain types of information I look and seek out, but it's definitely not in the context of what should my opening 7 moves be, man.
Right, exactly. And I think that you're exactly right when it comes to like faction balance, because the other example I can think of for this, and this is also legwork that you had done, Kellen, although I think it was at some point like more widely known about Chaos in the Old World, for example, where, what seems like the premise of the balance in that game is the Khorne faction, they basically are running the game, and if left unchecked, will win. So, there is some of that consideration when you're playing with different people, like, oh, maybe I'll let the person that is less comfortable with these sorts of games have that powerful position by default. And I think that sort of thing is important. Root comes to mind as a really good example where you would probably want to make sure that you have some idea about how the different factions operate before you allocate them to different players, or before you let players choose their factions.
I think the sort of opposite of this is the childlike wonder and the fun that can be found in the discovery from zero. If we all met in high school when we were even more ignorant than we are now, you have a game and no one knows what's balanced and what's not because you're not checking things. There is that process of discovery where you have more time. And I think in a way, we're all looking for shortcuts in adulthood to make sure that we have good games of things. And I think that there's an overcorrection to that too, where publishers make games to be designed for the very first play and perceived balance versus actual balance. And, we've gone into some of these things before, but in some ways, I think that for the best board game or the most anticipated board game ever, I think me, you, Christina, and Mark would probably play that game 3 times. Like, the most anticipated game of all time comes out and we hate it 3 times in a row. Would we return a 4th? So some of that legwork that can be done by other players to set up a balanced starting setup, a balanced player boards, that is how I try to use that preparatory information to just smooth the way for a better first few plays.
Yeah.
What do you think? 5 times? Would we play the most anticipated game of all time if we hated it all 5 times?
We would not.
It's the most anticipated of all time, Mark.
Our track record will show that.
Reality is it wouldn't make it past 2.
3.
Yeah. I think that's very valid. I think about that a lot also when it comes to like player count of the game. Like I sometimes am a little bit too beholden to the BGG's opinion of what the optimal player count for a game is when I'm playing it for the first time, rather than saying like, oh, well, Board Game Geek kind of says this doesn't really work above 4 players, so let's not play with that. Like, that's not probably the best way to operate, but it does feed into the same sort of thing, which is that we don't get to play all the games that we would love to play when there is new stuff coming out all the time. So I think we can all agree, though, that when it comes to looking up strategies online, that's kind of like a no-go zone for any of the 3 of us. Like, there would be no scenario where we would be investigating other strategies unless there was, like, the only time I can think this either comes to the bear is where there's this common knowledge that there's a dominant strategy.
Right. Diving deep into strategies, it just strikes me as a way to make a game less fun and more sort of mechanical. As important as winning is to me, like, that just seems like it would just make it for a less pleasurable experience. So I've never been really super tempted to do that. I mean, I can see if I was going to go into some sort of tournament or something where winning was more important than having fun, then maybe I'd be more inclined to do something like that. But in general, when you're playing with your friends, diving into strategies seems taking away from the experience.
Which is interesting on its own, right? Because, like, I think there are a lot of games where, like, meta discussion of strategies is the game. But I feel like they tend not to be the sort of games that we gravitate towards typically. The other side to this that I think gets interesting to me is how much you think you're sort of helping or hurting your group in particular by doing this. Now, Kellen, you've already mentioned this idea that, when it comes to the 4 of us and we're trying to create, like, an optimal first play, there is some legwork there. But how much of that do you think is, like, protective of your game group in the sense? Does that make sense? Like, how much responsibility do you have to preserve the sanctity of the game for your game group?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's so weird, right, is there are a certain subset of gamers, of which none of the 4 of us are, that are super, super adamant that you don't tell them anything about how the game works, even to the detriment of their own first few plays of the game. Like, the joy in the game for them is in the discovery, even though they're going to get got for the first 4 plays over and over again. And that has never struck me as the right mindset to have, but it works for some people. I think knowing what your group likes and doesn't like to talk about both before and after a game, will obviously make board game night better. But I think you can couch it in terminology like, hey, I've played this game many times, would you like to hear what people normally do? In fact, I had this situation come up in this week's game of Genoa. You are investing in infrastructure, and to steal infrastructure from another player, it's twice as expensive as just investing in your own infrastructure. And so someone knocked me out of my infrastructure at a great cost to them, and then was about to do it a second time. And, for my own self-interest, but also like in the context of the game, I'm like, this is a very expensive thing to do. Please do it if you want to do it, but like you probably don't want to do that. And that type of advice maybe was perhaps unsolicited and I shouldn't have done it. I ended up, winning the game by over $200. So, proving myself right, as usual. But,
that proved you right.
I don't know. Whatever. I'm blissful.
Okay. That's good. Fair. That's fair. What that makes me think of is sort of like a little bit of a gray area. I'm thinking of now Hallertau, which is a game where the rule book suggests that it's important early on in the game to take clay. And so I sort of wonder, a player who doesn't want to know information, what they would think of something like that. Because looking at the board and trying to, on your first play, trying to suss out why that would be an important thing is, I think, not obvious. But once you start playing it, a round or two in, it becomes very clear that you definitely want to take clay, and it should be a premium spot early in the game. And so that's sort of a weird sort of edge case where the rulebook itself is saying, hey, make sure to do this early. And I wonder players who want to be blissfully ignorant, what their take on that would be. It's sort of like the whole food chain magnate thing where, it's important to, I think, stress to players that their early selections are going to influence how well they do in the game. It's the same thing with a lot of splatter games where just early actions are going to mean a lot. So maybe a little bit of common knowledge or shared knowledge is something that you should impart to new players.
Yeah, I'm reminded of having just taught through the ages to Marnie, which is a game I've not taught to someone in person in a very, very long time. And that game in particular is very fraught with this idea that if you are experienced playing it with someone that's not played it before, that there's a lot of acquired information over the course of multiple games. I just said to Marnie up front, like, this is not going to be fun if I don't tell you some fundamental things. Like when iron comes up, that's like a focal point. There are certain cards that are strong gets and you shouldn't just let go by, the importance of military and that sort of thing. Like I knew that the game would not be worth playing if there wasn't some of that very minor coaching along the way. So I do think that there is some nuances to when this is appropriate. And obviously it depends on the other person. Like Marnie was receptive to that rather than saying, don't tell me anything, But that's obviously ultimately going to be some sort of tightrope balance with your group and like walking that line. As always, though, we're always interested in hearing your thoughts on this, and this seems like one that I think people will have a lot of disparate opinions on, so please sound off in the Discord if you have strong feelings either way on this topic. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And that's going to do it for this episode of the show. Thank you all for listening. As mentioned, you can find us on Discord, which is a great little chat community you can join on your desktop or on mobile for like hanging out and talking with us and a lot of great people in the community. It's a fantastic community that we've built. If I don't say so myself, it's just been a great place to talk about board games with people. That is at boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Otherwise, you can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can join our Board Game Geek Guild at boardgamebarrage.com/guild. Or you can find us on all of our social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. If you just search for us, you will find us. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music. What's in your mind, kid? Goodbye.
Bye.
So long, buckaroo. It's a cowboy thing.
Yeehaw.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mark, tell us about...
So Oh, good.
Sorry.
I
Tell us
there's
about.
like a delay or something.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
it seems like the delay
It
is
is.
worse this
Yeah.
week than usual.
Yeah.
Mark, tell us about.